Thank you for joining us for part 2 of No Country for Old Buildings interview with Kathy Kottaridis, the Executive Director of Historic Boston Incorporated. We pick up where we left off in the Roxbury section of Boston, at the Alvah Kittredge House, which was thoughtfully preserved and restored, with renovations being completed in 2014. Someone once said that Beverly has to make a choice between revitalization, economic development, or not. You seem to make the case that preserving buildings is revitalization.
Oh, yeah.
What are the benefits of preserving these buildings? And what do preserved buildings mean to you?
Well, I don't think that, I think most people agree now. Most people who study cities, and it doesn't matter where they are, realize that you have to have a diversity of circumstances in terms of scale of buildings, scale of certain neighborhoods, characteristics of neighborhoods, because that's what attracts people to not just come there and live there for a while, but to stay there, raise families there, and hopefully continue to make investments. So it makes other sense. It has other ripple effects. But I do think that preservation is very much about revitalization, and I think we're crazy if we think that we can set it apart from that argument. And revitalization is not just taking the most blighted, it's also looking at opportunities to expand the economic value of historic buildings. This building, again, empty for 20 years and allowed to really revert to an awful condition. And my sense is that what we've done here is put a whole new building back on the tax rolls. We've increased the property values of the radius of probably 2 blocks of this neighborhood by virtue of getting this done, because before it looked like the worst of a haunted house. And we've got 5 new units of housing. So my sense is that just take one small building like this, which is about 4,000, 5,000 square feet, and measure those impacts. You know, what is the tax increase from having done it? And now how did the assessments do in the next reassessment of the neighborhood? That's just one building. If you thought about that in relation to other properties and other opportunities, whole neighborhoods, and thought about where you can put in new development and where you can upgrade other properties, my sense is that we would continue to have a balanced portfolio of development opportunities and options in the city, and we would also have lots and lots of different tools for economic development, different things that we can sit on and claim economic victories from. So, you know, every community, and I'm sure Beverly does too, has industrial spaces that you're going to continue to have debates about whether housing should move in there now or whether it should stay industry because it feeds the restaurants and it supports jobs and those kinds of things. And it's worth having the debate. I think the good news is that if no debates are going on, you got to wonder, you know, how lively your community is.
Well, it seems like there's no debate because there's no room for debate. There are people that are making all the decisions. And if you bring an idea that may be a little different, you're ignored.
I think most people in the neighborhoods here would tell you that if they waited for the city fathers to ask them their opinion, it would never happen. So the reality, and I think the city fathers have also learned that they have to now ask because the communities will land on their doorstep. So activism is really important, and we get it too, by the way. Even us we're not above all of this. We get people who complain to us about the condition of our properties sometimes. We get the debate over what uses we're going to use. Affordability, do we really need any more affordable housing? Well, you know, you have to make courageous decisions, but the advocates need to really get out there and advocate, because otherwise you're going to get what you advocate for, and if you don't, you get nothing.
Yeah.
So it's important.
Okay, you showed us a picture of people standing in front of this building, and it struck a chord with me because you talked about how the community really loved it, and this one old building unified the community.
Yep.
What do you have to say about that? Quick thoughts.
Well, when we dedicated this building, we were ourselves tremendously heartened by the show of support and the good feeling here that night. I mean, it was, you don't get many of those, and it really was an incredible testimony to how much the community valued this. And it wasn't just folks from this immediate neighborhood, people came from all over who knew this house. And I think what we have to do as preservationists is we have to organize. We do. We go out early. Even before we acquired this property, we went out and started talking to people informally, and then through public meetings, generally inviting folks in, but also going to neighborhood meetings and making our presentations. And it's just, I don't know how else to underscore the point that it's not, yes, people probably would have come out for this no matter what, but I think what we really discovered is that you have to deliberately build a support network around the issues that you care about. And in this case, we spend, and in all of our projects, we spend a lot of time talking to people, building support, checking in, making sure people know what we're doing. I mean, we have a public mission as a nonprofit, so we got to, but the reality is that it has other benefits, so that when you want to take that picture, that people show up and they want to be in it.
I have some interesting comments that we get a lot of people that talk about how wonderful preserving old buildings are, and then there are the skeptics. Just want your opinion on some of these. It makes me laugh reading all those hysterical society comments about preserving a building because it once had significance. Have any of you thought about the significance of today's needs? There's a thing on the real estate reports called highest and best use. Someone please post an intelligent reason why they think the highest and best use of an address in 2013 is to redevelop a relic into something from the 1800s. First of all, I have to say, that's a very
it's provocative,
one-sided argument, and he's basically saying you want to turn everything into a museum, which we don't.
No, we don't. But we have to recognize that it might, redeveloping a two-story building might deny you the opportunity to build a six-story building. And that is true, and I think we should be very proud to be able to maintain a historic building if it's worthy of preservation and if it's got a great story and something that's meaningful, because it establishes character for a neighborhood in ways that new construction might not for a very long time.
Okay.
So I think we have to stand on the confidence that historic buildings define the communities that we live in, because what else will?
What do you think of the term eyesore? It's thrown around all the time, and people just use it as an excuse to say we need to level it. This one guy says best to demolish this long-standing eyesore and construct something new.
Eyesore does not equal demolition. Eyesore means that something has not been taken care of probably for a long time, and you can fix anything, yes, with the right amount of money, and money is probably the issue at the end of the day. But it is that mix of, and that balance of determining what is, what's worthy of being preserved with what can be preserved. And I don't know that those conversations always happen.
Now, there's another school of thought that first appeared in the 40s and 50s, urban renewal. We're talking about the bad urban renewal. Level everything, get rid of it, and build new. What do you think about that approach to revitalizing a city?
It's interesting because in Boston we are right now going through a new education process around the term urban renewal, capital U, capital R, and the renewal of our urban renewal legislation, so that we can keep using the powers of urban renewal in the 21st century. And people keep asking these questions and scratching their heads. Urban renewal, that's when you knocked everything down. But the reality is there were many phases of urban renewal, and some came with high incentives to knock things down and create higher density of residential units, shopping malls, things like that. But the powers of urban renewal, if I'm not mistaken, were used to get this property under control here at the Alvah Kittredge House only 5 years ago. And that was that instances of blight can utilize the powers of eminent domain in order to put a property on a different course. Not necessarily demolish it, but to take control of it and reverse the blight. let's go back to the question you were really asking, which is the wholesale removal of historic places.
The conventional wisdom now is that was a devastating thing for the soul of the community. That on paper everything looked great. We're going to have a new city, squeaky clean, brand new. But it really devastated the cities. It cut off the neighbors from the soul of their neighborhood, and it really changed the landscape.
Well, but don't we all think, those of us who've studied this and think about cities a lot, don't we all think that that was bad? And hence, isn't that the inspiration for preserving what we have around us today? That we, you know, as time goes on, new things become historic too, I suppose, but we need to look around us and make sure that the things that we have now that might not have been valued as much then, a lot of Victorian architecture in the 50s and 60s was thought to be disposable, and yet it really isn't. I mean, it's very important to keep because of scale, because of detail and architectural style that can't be replicated easily. And I think urban renewal was enough to put us on serious alert that we needed to be much more discriminating about what we keep and cautious about making those kinds of big wholesale removals in the interest of economic development.
Two quick questions. It seems like in the 1960s, people were asking, we've got to stop all this demolition of our historic resources. So the National Register Act was passed, and yet a lot of the preservation laws seem to have no teeth. Do you think that more should and could be done? Or are we just in this gray area of non-committal? We did something and we're going to throw our hands up and not do anything else?
I mean, personally speaking, no. I mean, it is not just about defending free enterprise and that we can do that's better. No, because think about what had to happen in order for that to occur. Somebody had to use eminent domain, which is not necessarily very property rights friendly, to achieve that level of disposal. And who did they do it to? But mostly to people who were not vested in their real estate to fight, or were poor. I mean, you could impose it on a group of people who didn't have enough money to make important improvements. But it didn't happen on Beacon Hill in Boston, did it? It happened on the backside where there were a lot fewer homeowners and less to really worry about. So there are some real justice issues around this that we all should be paying close attention to. It's not about free enterprise
Sadly,
alone.
this is going on to this day in New York, where a group of investors will say,
and Pittsburgh and Detroit,
we want that property, they don't want to sell it to us, so we're going to ask the city to take it and build a new Home Depot or the New York Times building, and whoever lived there before, their property rights are out the window.
Right. Every situation is unique, and so it needs to be looked at that way, but the reality is vigilance and advocacy is huge. And I would ask a complementary question, which is the preservation community making the real arguments that need to be made about real estate development, about the counter arguments around not just keeping but actually reactivating historic buildings, and how to do complementary development between new and old. I mean, there are lots and lots of places where I scratch my head and think to myself, did anybody think that they should have saved that set of apartments on that end and rehabilitated them and added on to the rest of the lot, you know? But
okay.
No.
Now around the corner there's a very modern looking building. I find the architecture to be interesting but a little strange for this neighborhood.
You're kind.
What do you think about putting something like that there?
That's a brand new building, and yet it looks like one of those muddled up 3-deckers that somebody decided to cover with siding or something. It is not the kind of architecture that I think is conducive to people's sense of place and feeling good about their neighborhood. Now, what it does do, and this is where I think we also have to be willing to debate and figure out alternatives, is it's a net positive building. It basically is putting energy back onto the grid, which has other huge benefits that a lot of properties, historic properties, can't possibly achieve. Now if you weighed things with the real scale and you looked at this building, which is a LEED certifiable building, we did not seek LEED certification here, but we upgraded all systems in here in a way where this is performing better than probably most other historic buildings in this neighborhood. But that building is super performing because of its white, super white exterior, few openings on the exterior. All of those things that aren't very attractive to the eye, but apparently are very good for the people who are living there and their monthly bills. I mean, let's put it all on a scale and balance it out and ask ourselves, you know, how do you create value? And I don't think most people, I think most people in this neighborhood are very simply walk by and don't make many comments about it.
That leads me to another question. In my life, I've seen, just in the last 10 years, a lot of new construction being built, huge apartment complexes, but they have a tendency to all be the same in design. They're boxes with a little lip on the top of the roof. Variations here and there, but you know, a hotel versus a storage unit versus an apartment complex all tends to look the same now. How do you think people will look back maybe 100 years from now on the new construction and the new construction we see around the corner in that building? What do you think they might say?
We probably will be having the same debates that we've been having about a lot of the things built in the 70s.
It's funny because 60s. A lot of the buildings in the 70s, people look at them. Now, they're historic now because enough time has passed, but people still look at them and say, these things have no value. They're just ugly and they're just like an ugly box.
So I'd like to think that we learn from poor design choices, and assuming that's ultimately the case, and that by learning that we begin you can't destroy those. You can't turn around and undo them because they're so big and so important and so valuable as real estate goes, but you can begin to think about what happens around them. And think about, because I don't think any of us would look at any American city and say every building is beautiful or that all of them would be great. So we can only hope that we're learning from our mistakes and putting those back and building our next generation of buildings better in response to that.
It's funny because people will say, well, colonial purists didn't like the Victorians. They thought they were gaudy and awful looking, but then through time people learned to appreciate them. And yet, I don't see that happening with a lot of the 70s architecture. There are brutalist fans out there, so I'm sorry if you're a brutalist fan.
I'm one of them. I am one of them. True confession. I think we may do these lovely, really ancient buildings, but I must tell you, good architecture is good architecture. Not all buildings are
bad architecture. Is bad architecture. Okay.
But that said, let's also just remember that in order to be a vibrant city, we've got to have places to put people and have people live and expand and grow and all of those things. So the same tension you were talking about before with the city fathers in Beverly is going to be the debate, has been the debate for the last 50, 60 years, and it's going to continue to be the debate. It's always going to be a struggle to make the right arguments around keeping what's most valuable and creating opportunities for growth and expansion of good designed buildings, hopefully.
Well, in Beverly, it seems we have a main street, Rantoul Street, and that is targeted for a lot of development. And in my opinion, there is a lot of room for development. I actually think what some of the development going on there is better than what was there before, like a brick warehouse that was once an Oldsmobile dealership. That's good, but what we have next to the train station makes up a historic district, and I'm thinking we shouldn't be destroying a historic district. That's too much history there.
I hope, and I can tell you, I think that this is one of my pet peeves, but I don't think I'm too far off, that there are a lot of people in planning and development at the municipal level who, if a pro forma were put in front of them, if a developer was willing to share their pro forma, which is not always the case, to make the arguments about how much money they will keep or lose or whatever by making an adjustment, many of them wouldn't be able to really understand it. And I don't know your people, so I can't be criticizing anyone in particular. But I can honestly tell you, I think that in certain professions, preservation and planning in particular, there aren't a lot of folks who really are able to get deeply into the economics of historic preservation and the details of development.
That's why I'm talking to you.
And we've got to help our folks in preservation understand that they got to add to the toolbox, because it's the only way to sit at the table legitimately and have those arguments. Arguments based on aesthetics.
It's tough,
in an age where we need housing desperately.
Right.
Desperately, that just won't stand up. But why can't historic buildings and their reactivation be part of an affordable housing agenda? There's no reason why it can't be.
Do you think society does a lousy job teaching people to respect history?
I think that's one of the biggest issues that we have in education right now. I don't think that in the course of creating new standards for education that history is one of the priorities. We think about all of the new technologies and things that are going to take us forward, and I believe in all of that, but I have to say I think history can teach us a lot about how people respond to certain situations, and I don't know that we spend enough time on it. Now that said, it's clear to me that a lot of people have a good, positive gut reaction to historic places, beauty, and the balance that this Greek temple represents, for example. And I think that we've benefited from that. I mean, in this community, you have a lot of people who were not immersed in northern New England architecture, a lot of immigrants, all of that, and yet there's a profound respect for the neighborhood history and the character of this place.
It's funny because when I look at history, I had teachers that really didn't do a good job conveying what history was. And then it was through my love of old buildings, my love of trains and the transit system of
Sure.
the days gone by. You'll come across an old depot and you'll wonder, what did this place look like when people were using the train?
Yeah.
And then from there you go to, well, these people were just like us.
Sure.
They were you and me, only born maybe 100 years ago.
Right.
And I think that's what a lot of people are missing when they look at history. They see the black and white photo,
Yep.
and that creates distance. Well, those were those people back then. But I see people like that, well, they were us.
Yep.
If I had been born back then, maybe
That's
I would have
right.
worked at a mill.
That's right.
That said, 100 years from now, people will be looking at us, and
Yeah.
I'm very curious, what will they say about our generation? Especially now that people are on their smartphones all the time, and they can't seem to talk to each other or have a conversation.
Yeah, it's true, but I can't imagine that we won't continue to have discussions about how human beings react to place and home and all of those things that you can't always teach in a classroom. Let's be clear that even though I think a lot of people aren't learning the broad timetables of history, I think they are it's not just in school that we learn history. It's up to us in our, we try to do it in our own little way with our buildings that we put interpretive panels inside each building and hopefully on the outside, and there's one coming for this one, but we want to make sure if people understand why we did this. I mean, it's not just getting it going again and putting a bunch of people to live in it. It's really meant to help keep a piece of the history of this very complex neighborhood, on people's, on their screen.
Well, one interesting thing, when you tear down historic buildings and state money is involved, sometimes they have these things where you can mitigate the loss. And one of them is just take a bunch of pictures of it. And that may mitigate the loss, archive the building. To me, I think having the real thing right in front of your eyes just hits home the history in an instant, where a photograph just doesn't do it justice. And you get these people who would say, well, just take a whole bunch of pictures of it, put it in a filing cabinet, and let it be torn down. What do you think of that view? I mean, granted, sometimes you have to do that, but I think it's always best to have the real thing.
But I think it's very complex and a complicated question, and I think one of the things that we come to appreciate about our communities is when we can have a mix of architectural experiences and I mean, I look at this and if we were following that theory alone, and I know that you don't mean it this way, but if we were following that theory alone, this building would be in the middle of probably a 4-acre property with gardens around it and additions onto it and glassed-in conservatories and all kinds of lovely things for a very rural, wealthy existence. And yet what happened here? At some point, this building really represents the growth of the neighborhood. All of the extensions on it were cut off. This front temple format was picked up, turned around, and brought right up here against this newly created street that was ultimately beginning to get these late 19th century buildings built on it, which we value today. But they were intrusions at that time. I guess I have to say cities are dynamic, and we have to try to make the best decisions we can, not listen only to economic arguments, which I think reinforces your point. These are not just about economic arguments. They've got to make some sense because we can't go bankrupt on these matters. But the fact is that we also have to stand on some principles around historic preservation, around neighborhood history, around community history, because we will have those moments where we go, God, if somebody had saved that. Well, too late, right?
Yeah.
But we also need to recognize that there will be a need for new construction, and land is not plentiful anymore, and we've got to make some tough decisions, but we also need to weigh all of that and not just listen to developers who may sound like they're looking to make the community better, but I think what they're, in most cases, most developers are trying to make sure that they make a living. Can't fault them for that, but it's up to the community and public officials to make sure that they're parsing that argument to make sure that they understand exactly where the community benefit lies.
Last question.
Yeah.
Speaking to the camera over there, what do you want to say to Beverly? I know at one of the meetings you said every community should have a Historic Boston Incorporated. Unfortunately, not every community does. Very few communities do, and Beverly certainly doesn't. What would you want to tell Beverly?
Well, I think Beverly, you should think about getting or starting a nonprofit like Historic Boston. It took us, we're 55 years old, it took us a long time to get where we are, but you need to start. But having the tools in place and a group that's solely focused on actual bricks and mortar preservation is very, very important. I also think that collaboration is really important, that preservationists need to work closely with community development folks, with institutional users, and others who are interested in the same things, perhaps not in the same fashion. Preserving downtown or preserving affordable housing. All of these things work together. We do it, we have to, in order to make our mission really meaningful. So, a lot of things are possible with an expanded toolbox. So I'm often arguing that we need more preservation revolving funds.
Well, I think that's just about all the time we have here. I want to thank you.
Thank you.
For
Good luck.
meeting with us. Thank you. So Kathy Kottaridis from Historic Boston Incorporated. I'm Matt Pujo, and this has been another edition of No Country for Old Buildings.
I think it's really about being educated, but I think the question you're really asking is, what about the, can we stop?
You're famous!
What are you doing here? What are you doing home?
I live here.
How are you? Do you want to come on the record?
On the record for?
The Beverly, what is it?
BevCam, we're a cable access. We're telling
Up in
people
Beverly.
about historic buildings and how wonderful they are.
I'm going to pass, but I could not drive by without saying hello.
Napoleon just drove by in front of you. Take care, Celia. Former board member. Lives over there.
Cool.